All right, welcome. Today we're going to break down a really fascinating analysis of the deep forces shaping modern politics. Basically, looking at how a manufactured divide might be serving interests way behind the scenes.
So let's just dive right into the central puzzle this analysis is trying to solve. I mean, have you ever noticed this weird contradiction? You've got some political movements that are all about freedom and individual liberty, but then they push for policies that seem to do the exact opposite? It's this strange disconnect, and it's sitting right at the heart of our political world today.
So on one side, you've got this awesome promise. More personal freedom, less government getting in your way. Sounds great, right? But then you look at what's actually happening, the policies being passed, and it feels like a total 180. Well, according to the analysis we're digging into, this isn't some accident. Nope, it's a feature, not a bug.
And look, this isn't just some vague feeling, right? The analysis points to some really specific examples. We're talking about new laws that make it a lot harder to vote, much harsher penalties if you want to protest, constant attacks on journalists, and even new rules about what teachers are allowed to say in a classroom. It's like each one of these is chipping away at the foundations of an open society.
Okay, so what in the world explains this huge gap between the words and the actions? Well, the source we're looking at lays out a framework, and it suggests that this is all part of a very deliberate, two-part strategy that's being driven by a small, super wealthy elite.
Now, before we get any deeper, we need to get clear on a really key term, oligarchy. And it's super important to get this right. In this context, oligarchy isn't about one political party or another. Instead, it describes a system, any system, where a massive concentration of wealth leads directly to a massive concentration of political power.
So how does this whole system stay in control? The analysis we're looking at says it's a pretty straightforward two-part strategy. Step 1 is to quietly lock in the economic agenda that the donors want. And step 2 is to loudly fire up a cultural base to get all the votes you need to make it happen. Let's break down how these two things, which seem so different, actually work perfectly together.
All right, so this gets us to the core mechanics of the whole thing. You've got a quiet part that's all about the money and a very loud part that's all about the culture. They're two sides of the same coin, and they're designed to work in a cynical but perfect harmony.
All right, let's start with the quiet part. What the analysis says is the real prize here. The economic agenda is actually pretty simple. The goal is to use political power to do three main things: get huge tax cuts for corporations and the super rich, weaken regulations that are supposed to protect people and the planet, and finally, push corporate costs like cleaning up pollution onto the public.
And this is where it gets really interesting, right? There's this total double standard for how the idea of limited government gets used. According to this analysis, when it comes to things like social programs, healthcare, or education, that funding gets slashed. But spending on things that benefit contractors, like defense, or protect property, like enforcement, well, that often goes up. So government is limited for you, but it's pretty unlimited for its friends.
So that leads to the big question, right? How on earth do you get millions of people to vote for policies that really only benefit a tiny handful of people at the top? Well, the answer, according to this analysis, is that you turn the culture war into an engine for votes. You create this massive, loud, emotional distraction. And that's the loud part of the strategy.
And this is why you absolutely need a polarizing figure at the center of it all. They become what the analysis calls a performance artist of resentment. They just soak up all the attention, all their controversies, their attacks on cultural enemies. It completely dominates the news. And while everyone's watching the show, that quiet economic agenda we just talked about gets pushed through in the background without anybody really noticing.
You know, this whole pattern of incredible wealth creating political division to protect itself, it's not new at all. In fact, history has some pretty serious warnings about where this can all end up.
So the analysis points to two big historical parallels. First, you've got the late Roman Republic, where insane levels of wealth inequality led to political violence, civil war, and eventually the end of the Republic itself. And then you have America's own Gilded Age, with the robber barons creating a very similar dynamic. The big difference? That time, it was met with a massive popular backlash, the Progressive Era, which actually managed to rebalance the system.
Which brings us to the million-dollar question. If we're seeing this pattern again, where are we headed this time? According to this source, a system like this is just, well, it's totally unstable, and it's heading for one of three possible futures.
I mean, think about it. A system that's designed to pull wealth up to a tiny few while distracting everyone else, it can't last, right? Sooner or later, the cracks start to show, and the whole thing gets pushed toward a breaking point. The real question is, what's going to give first?
So the analysis lays out 3 possible in-game scenarios. Path 1, the whole thing just rots from the inside and collapses fiscally. Path 2, it actually becomes a stable authoritarian system, where the elite just lock in their power for good by getting rid of democratic freedoms. Or Path 3, a popular rebalancing, sort of a modern progressive era, where the public demands and gets major systemic reform.
Okay, so how do we get to that third option, the one that sounds a lot better? Well, the analysis says there's a critical trigger. It's the moment when the economic pain that people are feeling becomes so real and so widespread that the loud cultural war just doesn't work as a distraction anymore. And getting there usually requires a unified opposition that's focused on economic justice. And sometimes you even see a few key elites switch sides when they realize the whole system is getting way too unstable for their own good.
And that's really where this whole analysis leaves us. It's not about predicting the future. It's about showing that these massive historical forces are pushing us toward a major choice, a real fork in the road. And it leaves us with one final huge question to think about. Which path are we on?